So why have we called you here? Because we're finding nitrogen in our water resources in Minnesota, and we can do better. We're looking at all kinds of data from across the state. We've got more than 50,000 samples from surface waters that we analyzed to come up with this information. I'm going to let Dave walk you through it and what we found. Importantly, what it means is that it's a lost resource for Minnesota farmers because nitrogen that's applied to fields is going downstream. That nitrogen can have impacts on our aquatic life, on the health of our environment, and on the health of our citizens. So it's important that we get ahead of this information and start working to reduce the amount of nitrogen we find in our surface waters. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave Wall to make his presentation, which will be about 6 or 10 minutes, and then we'll be available to answer questions.
Certainly. Dave Wall, W-A-L-L. My name is Dave Wall. I'm the lead hydrologist who worked for the MPCA on the study of nitrate in surface waters. I worked with 15 other scientists from the University of Minnesota, the U.S. Geological Survey, and others on this study. Let me begin by saying that nitrate is a common pollutant. It's found in surface waters and groundwaters around the country, yet in undisturbed landscapes it's found at quite low levels. It's human activities that can greatly increase nitrate levels in our surface waters. The concerns about nitrate in surface waters have been increasing in the past couple of decades for 3 key reasons. First, other studies are showing that high levels of nitrate are harmful to the food chain for fish in our own Minnesota waters. Second, as nitrate then gets into our rivers, flows down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico, it contributes to a large dead zone or low oxygen zone in the Gulf known as hypoxia. And thirdly, we have been discovering that there are more streams exceeding nitrate standards which were put in place to protect drinking water supplies. With this study now, we have a good understanding of 4 key things. We understand the extent of the problem, we understand how nitrate is getting into our surface waters, we understand the trends over time, and we understand options for dealing with it and reducing nitrate levels. Let me start with the extent of the problem. We looked at monitoring results from over 50,000 samples of water from rivers and streams. And what we find is that northern Minnesota, if you look at the map here to your right, northern Minnesota in the green has low and very low nitrate levels. So we look at southern Minnesota, we see high and very high nitrate levels, with the highest levels in south central Minnesota represented by red. From southern Minnesota, that nitrate mostly leaves in the Mississippi River system, and we see 158 million pounds of nitrate per year on average leaving the state and headed on down toward the Gulf. So how's it getting into our waters? The University of Minnesota worked very closely with the MPCA to examine sources and pathways for how nitrate gets into surface waters. The majority of nitrate is coming from cropland, from fertilizers, manure, and the soil itself on corn ground and other crops which do not have roots actively removing the nitrate during the spring and fall months. Now, there are many different sources of nitrate, as you can see in this pie chart here to my left. And each source matters, particularly at the local level. Take, for example, the wastewater portion. It's 9% of the statewide load, but yet in an urban watershed, that's going to be a very important source. If we look at the green areas, that represents the cropland contributions of nitrate to surface waters, and there's 3 key pathways there. Now, when most people think of pollution from cropland, they think of what's washing off of the fields and getting into our rivers and streams. Nitrate is different. Nitrate, the key pathways are groundwater and tile drainage. Cropland runoff only represents 5% of the statewide nitrate load into surface waters. So let me explain this a little further with these two key categories of cropland groundwater and cropland tile drainage. When precipitation falls and hits the land, much of it infiltrates and it brings with it the nitrate, picks up the nitrate in the soil and brings it to the shallow groundwater. Shallow groundwater then moves over into rivers and streams. If there happens to be a well on the way, then that well would be impacted by the nitrate as well. Now, much of our state, we have tile drainage a few feet below the soil surface. And this works differently. Here, the precipitation comes, picks up the nitrate-rich waters then move into the tile drains, and then the water is piped or routed rather quickly out on into the ditches, which then lead to streams and rivers. We are seeing an increasing amount of tile drainage in Minnesota in recent years. The next thing I want to talk about are the trends. How has nitrate been changing over time? We work closely with the U.S. Geological Survey to look at trends going back to the mid-1970s, and we looked at 50 rivers around the state to look at these trends. And what we found is that the Mississippi River has been consistently showing increasing nitrate levels. Other rivers in the state, we see a mixed results. We see some increases, we see some decreases, we see some that are staying relatively flat and with no trend. Now the Minnesota River, that is our biggest nitrate loading river in the state. And that river, we have more recently seen some stabilizing and decreasing trends. But it still remains very high and still by far our highest loading river. Lastly, how can we reduce nitrate levels? We can get a 15 to 20% reduction by doing two things. One is to further optimize the efficiency in our nitrogen fertilizers going onto cropland. And the second thing would be to take the tile drainage waters and capture and treat those waters before they can get into our rivers and streams. To go above the 15 to 20% reduction, we need more vegetative cover on the land, more roots. And this can be accomplished on row crops through cover crops. We need more research on cover crops, but that's one possibility. And also putting perennial crops in marginal cropland areas and riparian zones. In conclusion, our study shows a widespread problem with nitrate in southern Minnesota. This problem did not occur overnight, and it's not going to be solved overnight. It is going to take a long-term, sustained, concerted effort by many, many people over millions of acres of land in order to achieve the reductions we need to protect our water resources. The good news is that Minnesota has launched several efforts that will move us toward making progress in reducing nitrate from cropland and urban sources. That chart over on your left shows several statewide efforts which have begun, and there are others, but those are some key ones right there. At this time, unless Commissioner Stein has anything else to add, we will take your questions.
Thank you, Dave. And I just wanted to mention the standards. Dave mentioned a standard that exists for drinking water in our state. That's a standard for nitrogen, nitrates that's out under the Safe Drinking Water Act requirements. The PCA is under an obligation to adopt a standard for nitrogen in surface waters, and that's to protect aquatic life, the food chain and the fishery resource that is in our rivers and streams. So that's the standard that we'll be working on together. With that, we'd like to answer any questions that you have. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm curious when you mentioned about 50,000 samples taken, over what period of time were those pulled?
Dave.
The 50,000 number, that was for samples taken from 2000 to 2010. We did also look at additional sampling that goes prior to 2000. I mentioned the trends that go back into the mid-1970s, so actually there's more than 50,000, but that 50,000 number is just 2000 to 2010.
Go ahead.
Zooming right in on agriculture and where it's orange and red there on the map, I'm just curious, you mentioned about drainage being a movement there with the nitrates and nitrogen. How has drainage installation changed from then 2000 to 2010? I guess what I'm getting at, has there been some impact possibly on, you know, are new drainage systems making a difference or not, or is there still old drainage in that part of the state? Could you address that?
Yeah, there will be both old and new drainage represented by the numbers where we have conducted monitoring. And so it's the combination of old drainage and new drainage that has contributed to the nitrate that we're seeing.
Okay, so you're not saying maybe some of the newer things they're doing like controlled drainage, that might be making a positive impact?
The controlled drainage and research has shown, yeah, that we can make a reduction with controlled drainage, with wetlands for treatment, bioreactors. There are other options being researched and investigated. The key is how many of them do we have installed? And it's going to take, as I mentioned, we can't just go into little small areas and hot spots to solve this problem. It's got to be a widespread effort over millions of acres.
I think what you'd see if you look at the, you know, we're not going down examining individual watersheds in this presentation today, but the data can, you can understand that it took a lot of individual actions to get us to this result. It's going to take the cumulative efforts of many to achieve the reverse. And so it's going to take a lot of effort to work on how we're going to retrofit or redesign or modify practices on the land. And I think it's really an opportunity for innovation. This is where Minnesota does its best work, is when we identify through environmental science what we see in the world that's an undesirable result. This should be looked upon as a time when we say, now let's roll up our sleeves and get to work on doing something to improve it. Other questions?
You mentioned planting perennial crops on marginal land and riparian areas. How much do we need to do there? I mean, where are we now, and how much land needs to be taken out of production in order to get to more than that 15% reduction?
When we convert row crops into perennial crops, we do see a rather quick turnaround in terms of nitrate movement downwards, so it's a fairly quick response. In terms of how much, we looked at various scenarios on that to see how much change we would need. Specifically, we used a tool from the University of Minnesota that they developed for us for this study that allowed us to look at various scenarios of adoption of perennials and other best management practices. And we targeted the marginal cropland, and we looked at all the marginal cropland and converting that to perennials. We also looked at all the riparian areas and converting that to perennials. And if we do those things and put on cover crops, we can increase our effectiveness in reducing nitrate. Instead of getting 15 to 20%, we can approach nearly 30% reduction.
Do you know how much land you're talking about? How many acres?
Not offhand, sorry.
But you sort of just said, if we do that everywhere, all the marginal cropland.
Riparian buffers.
Yeah,
yep,
all
right.
that. So
that would be a net improvement of 30%. That would be a net improvement of 30% reduction in nitrates. So in order to move beyond that, we would need additional measures above and beyond sort of the perennial crop covers or perennial grass and vegetation in riparian zones. Sorry.
If we do all that and you hit 30%, I mean, what number does the state need to shoot for? I mean, is 30% enough? You know, what's the goal, and how do you know when you've reached it?
Well, we're working. It depends. let me just say that we're working on several scales here, right? There's a scale that's at a local level, there's a scale at Minnesota's level, and there's a scale that's national because of the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So when we look at all of those scales, it depends on which one you want to aim for. I believe the national task force that's working on a nitrogen strategy for the Gulf of Mexico is looking somewhere around the 45% reduction in nitrate loads for the health of the Gulf. Within the state, then, it will vary depending on the localized conditions, and right now we do not yet have the standard developed for our own water resources that we will need to make that calculation of what's the load we're going to need on an individual watershed basis to meet the aquatic life standards that we will promulgate.
So how did you reach the 30% reduction standard or goal?
The 30% number is a number that we looked at if we adopted all of the practices that we could. The University of Minnesota laid out a suite of practices that could be adopted. And they looked at where those could be adopted in Minnesota. If all of those were adopted by all the farmers, the cropland sources could be reduced by 30%. That's where that number came from.
So another way of saying that was it wasn't a standard, it was a what would that scenario produce in terms of reductions.
What are some of the other bad effects? You mentioned hypoxia. I mean, do downriver water treatment plants have to deal with this? Does it cost them money? I mean, what are some of the other things that affect people with nitrates in the river?
Well, certainly when we develop standards for a water resource, a river, everyone who contributes to the problem becomes a part of the solution. That's our watershed approach in Minnesota. We look at those standards and allocate the loads according to who's contributing to the source of the problem. So once we've developed a standard, that will be the approach we'll take. The standard will then define within a given watershed and within a specific body of water who needs to do what in terms of reducing their loads. But one of the things that we know will need to be addressed is what's the amount of nitrogen that's beneficial or safe for the aquatic life to thrive and survive. It also is true that we want to protect those shallow groundwater areas for drinking water purposes. Shallow groundwater in some parts of the country and some parts of Minnesota are drinking water sources, and we want to make sure that residential well owners have safe drinking water as well.
How soon does this standard come about?
The development of the standard is underway right now. We're working with some other states and with specifically with the state of Illinois and with the US EPA on gathering additional data that will support the development of our standard. The standard will probably take us about 2 to 3 more years to put in place. And the reason that is because those studies need to be complete to form the scientific basis for the standard, and then the rulemaking process takes over after that. And the rulemaking process under the statutes lasts roughly 18 months to 2 years. Other questions?
I want to ask a question my editor told me to ask. And I preface it. Why don't we ask farmers not to use nitrogen?
Well, I'm not the farming expert. Our agency is the environmental scientists in the state. So I know that farmers use nitrogen for crop yields, and there are a number of demands for crops. So agriculture and the demand for agricultural products is why farmers are applying nitrogen in the first place. So I think one of the challenges that you might hear from agricultural experts is we need to produce a specific yield to be cost effective and to meet demands. And that would probably be the answer. I'm seeing Commissioner Frederickson is nodding his head. Maybe you could ask Commissioner Frederickson that question offline.
Well, my next question is more like, what are we going to do about this? You said if, every single square inch of land that should be perennial crop or buffer zone is made that way. But we know it's not that way now. So what will be the process of developing a new approach that will work?
Well, let's say this. Governor Dayton, Secretary Vilsack, the EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson agreed that we needed to do some work in our state on agricultural water quality, and the governor just announced 4 pilot projects a couple of weeks ago. We need to make those pilot projects work, because what they're going to do is demonstrate how we can improve water quality through on-the-land practices implemented on a voluntary basis by Minnesota farmers. We need to make those pilot projects work, and then we need to expand that work. We also need to get clear about what we need in our water resources. How much reduction is our actual goal? To do that, we need to set our standard, we need to continue to monitor our water resources, and we need to work with communities across the state to implement actions. I also would say it's important that we continue to do agricultural research and development of best management practices related to fertilizer application rates, which includes amount, timing, delivery methods, those sorts of things, as well as what are the measures that will actually benefit our water resources in terms of reducing the yield of nitrogen off our agricultural landscape. So we really need to roll up our sleeves and take an everybody in, all approaches need to be explored effort. That will lead us over time, we believe, and as you heard Dave say earlier, we are seeing some reductions in nitrates in our surface waters as we look back over the past several decades. We need to accelerate that rate of reduction. Other questions?
I'm just curious, on the map, the gray areas, it says no data available. Why no data for some of those parts of the state, specifically in the south?
Yeah, we do have data we're collecting now, and so we will be able to update that for those watersheds that are in gray. The other thing that we did with this study was we didn't rely on any one sort of monitoring, one sort of modeling. We looked at a combination of different data sets from monitoring, and we also looked at modeling of the state, and they're showing the same sort of picture. So we do have data for some of those watersheds from some modeling efforts and from some other data, but just this particular data set, which is monitoring based at the outlets of the watersheds, we didn't at the time have all watersheds.
There's the 9% of the excess nitrogen is coming from water treatment plants. Can you explain what would be involved with reducing that 9% for those water treatment plants? Do they have to put in new treatment systems? Is it even possible to do it?
Yes, we have 20 chapters in the report, and one of the chapters do address wastewater and how we can reduce nitrate from wastewater. And there are a couple of methodologies that will get you between 35 and 65% reduction from that particular category. Not overall in the state, but just 35 to 65% reduction of that 9%. So, so those are there are two technologies that will work, have been shown to work.
And how expensive are they?
That was not addressed in the study.
I think one of the things when we look across all these sectors, we look at the relative contribution. It's like in what are the sources that are leading to the challenge that we face? And when we look at this chart, we say, okay, there's a chunk of all of the atmospheric, the wastewater, and so forth. We're looking for strategies that will be cost effective, but ultimately we'll be dealing with that through our load allocations that come once the standard is developed, and then we'll be basing that on relative contributions. Yes, sir.
Seems like you're looking at mainly cropland here. I'm just wondering, for the time being or the near future, are you just asking for voluntary efforts?
At this point, the primary efforts underway are voluntary measures. I think one of the things that farmers realize is that when their nitrogen goes downstream, it's a loss. It's a loss to their farm operation. They're losing a resource that they paid for, in many respects, to grow their crop, and that's just inefficient. And I don't think any Minnesota farmer intends that to be the case. So we want to work hard to help our friends in agriculture do a better job of maximizing their investment and not impacting the receiving waters.
Follow up with once you establish a standard to protect aquatic life, basically, right? If it were a factory, then they couldn't exceed the standard. Will that apply to farmers too?
The Clean Water Act exempts agriculture from direct regulatory responsibility. One of the things we've done in Minnesota through our watershed restoration protection strategy is to identify all sources, just as we've done here, and then look at what's required to meet the standard from regulated sources of discharge and unregulated. We still cannot regulate unregulated sources. However, we can identify the load allocation that needs to be reduced, and we will work through our local units of government, many times county soil and water conservation districts, watershed districts, municipalities, working together to collectively address that problem. Will then be asked how they voluntarily or through other methods, maybe land retirement programs, maybe incentives or other best management practices can help meet the load. So we will do our part of doing the environmental science work of identifying the loads, identifying the standards, and then working through our partners to implement practices that will achieve healthier watersheds.
Do you have a timeline on that?
Well, the standard will take us a couple more years, and we're rolling out some of our watershed restoration protection strategies now. The Clean Water Fund investments that began in 2008 set us on that path, and we're now developing our watershed restoration protection strategies documents for about 8 watersheds a year. So we are moving forward with those watersheds to identify all of the regulated and unregulated sources on a wide variety of standards and contaminants. So we're making progress, but we're at the early stages of that progress.
Now, this may also be beyond the scope of your report, but the 3 watersheds down at the bottom that are bright red, what's going on there? Is that just the nature of the geology? Is it the way farming is practiced in those watersheds? Why are they the highest?
We did run some statistical analyses looking at various watershed characteristics and comparing that with the nitrate levels that we're seeing, so we could try and figure out what are some of the key variables influencing those nitrate levels. And tile drainage is certainly a key factor down in those areas and other south central Minnesota watersheds. And so it's row crops over the tile drainage was the primary factor. Precipitation also can come into play as well. So higher precipitation, you get higher loads and higher yields, higher nitrate coming out.
We know from state climatology information from Dr. Mark Seeley and folks at the DNR that we're experiencing more intense spring and summer rainfall events across southern Minnesota. That's complicating this problem as well, because again, a farmer's application of nitrogen is intended to be used by the crop. They don't intend it to be washed away. They intend it to be available for their crop. When it's applied and we get an intense rainstorm, that can accelerate this problem. So as the climate continues to change, this will be one of the things we'll need to address for adaptation to climate change, is how we can address discharges that are coming off of those more intense rainfalls.
Just getting back to the reddest area, what's the soil type down there? Can you talk a little bit more about that and the topography? I'd like to know a little bit more about the reddest area she asked about. Yeah, we did look at some soils variables for the watersheds around the state, and we looked at soil organic matter, and certainly soil organic matter it can be a source of nitrate that gets into tile drainage and into groundwater, along with the fertilizers and manure. And so in those areas we do have some of our rich cropland soils. That's why we're growing the crops that we are. Highly productive soils, and they also have relatively high organic matter too. But that didn't seem to be the driving variable for influencing the nitrate concentrations. It was more the tile drainage and the types of crops that were being grown.
Maybe a couple more questions and we can be done. If people have any last questions, I'd look, yeah.
I always think the last
Thank
question
you.
or more than one last question. So there's been no discussion of, or no attempts, I think, to address perhaps what is the more fundamental issue here, which is how we farm. that the reason why we have so much nitrogen is also because of the crops that we grow, which is corn and soybeans. So is there anything that can and should be done to change the intensity of that type of farming in Minnesota as a way to address this problem?
Well, it's a valid concern that the mix of crops that we grow in Minnesota is a contributor in this discussion. To change that mix would require quite a deal of conversation with the agricultural producers and the economic sectors in our state. We know, as Dave said, that deeper rooting crop systems will benefit the amount of nitrogen that's released. It will not, they will use more nitrates in the soil water and take it up for permanent use. So changing the mix of our agricultural products and supplies is a broader conversation than I, as an environmental scientist, can answer today. Our job is to identify this information and then turn to our partners in other sectors to take action. I agree that it needs to be discussed, and we need to have that conversation, and I'm glad that Commissioner Frederickson is here from the Department of Agriculture and others, John Jaschke from the Board of Water and Soil Resources, to help, respond to this question. And perhaps you'd have a question for Dave after we're completed that you might want to ask that of him. One thing I just want to leave you with today is Minnesota's at the top of our continental watersheds. We're at the top of the watershed for the Mississippi River, which flows into the Gulf of Mexico. We're at the top of the watershed for the Red River to the north that ends up in Hudson Bay and makes its way through Lake Winnipeg, which is experiencing similar concerns with hypoxia. We're at the head of the watershed for the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway, and 99.2% of the water that comes out of our state fell on our state. It's our responsibility to begin the process of cleaning it up, and we're number one in the watershed. We should be number one in responding. Thanks for being here today.